Fidel Alejandro Castro was born on August 13, 1926, in Byron, a remote rural settlement in what was then Oriente Province in eastern Cuba. His father, Ángel Castro Argaiz, was a Spanish immigrant from Galicia who arrived in Cuba as a laborer and later became a prosperous sugar plantation owner. His mother, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, began life on the plantation as a domestic worker before becoming Ángel Castro's partner and, later, his wife. Fidel's childhood unfolded between two worlds. On one side was relative comfort and access to education. On the other was the harsh poverty of rural workers who lived and died cutting sugarcane for little reward. This contrast left a deep impression on him. Fidel was an intelligent and difficult child. He was known for his stubbornness, his refusal to accept authority without challenge, and his intense competitiveness. He attended several Catholic boarding schools, including Colegio Dolores in Santiago de Cuba, and later the elite Colegio de Balen in Havana. At Balen, priests noted his discipline and strong will, describing him as someone who would not accept a secondary role in life. He was not the best student academically, but he stood out for his confidence, physical endurance, and desire to lead. In 1945, Fidel entered the University of Havana to study law. At the time, the university was less a place of quiet learning and more a battleground of political factions. Student gangs were common, violence was frequent, and political loyalty could mean life or death. Cuba itself was unstable. Corruption ran deep, and many Cubans believed their country was effectively controlled by foreign business interests, particularly from the United States. Fidel immersed himself in this environment. He joined nationalist student groups and became increasingly vocal in his opposition to corruption and foreign influence. During these years, he was exposed to Marxist theory, anti-imperialist writings, and the idea that social change could not be achieved through polite reform alone. He admired figures who reshaped history through force and conviction. Gradually, he came to believe that power was the only language corrupt systems understood. In 1947, Fidel joined an armed expedition planned to overthrow the Dominican dictator, Rafael Trujillo. The mission collapsed before it began, but the experience hardened his belief in armed struggle. The following year, he was in Bogotá, Colombia, when the assassination of political leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitan sparked massive riots, known as the Bogotazo. Fidel witnessed chaos firsthand. Order dissolved within hours. Governments fell apart quickly when authority lost legitimacy. This lesson stayed with him. By the early 1950s, Fidel had graduated as a lawyer and was practicing law in Havana. In 1952, Cuba was preparing for national elections. Fidel planned to run for parliament as a candidate of the Orthodox Party, a reformist group popular among working-class voters. The election never happened. On March 10, 1952, General Fulgencio Batista seized power in a military coup, suspended the Constitution, and canceled the vote. Fidel was outraged. He initially attempted to challenge Batista through the courts, filing legal petitions that accused the dictator of violating the Constitution. The courts dismissed the case. For Fidel, this confirmed what he already believed. The system was designed to protect itself, not the people. Peaceful opposition, in his view, was useless. He began organizing a small group of young men, mostly students and workers, who shared his anger and sense of urgency. They planned a bold attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, the second-largest military base on the island. Fidel believed that a dramatic act would spark a nationwide uprising. On July 26, 1953, the attack was launched. It was a disaster. Poor planning, bad timing, and lack of coordination doomed the mission. Many rebels were killed during the fighting or executed afterward. Fidel was captured days later while hiding in the countryside. At his trial, Fidel represented himself. Instead of defending his actions, he turned the courtroom into a political stage. He spoke for hours, condemning Batista's regime, listing its crimes, and outlining a vision for a new Cuba. His speech ended with a phrase that would later become legendary: "History will absolve me." He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Fidel was sent to the Isle of Pines, where he spent nearly 2 years in confinement. Prison became a school rather than a punishment. He read extensively, debated constantly, and refined his ideas. Pressure from the public and from the Catholic Church eventually led to a general amnesty. In 1955, Batista released Fidel and other political prisoners, believing they no longer posed a threat. Batista was wrong. Fidel went into exile in Mexico, where he immediately began planning another revolution. It was there that he met Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentine doctor with radical ideas and a deep hatred of imperialism. The two men formed a strong bond based on shared beliefs and mutual admiration. Fidel emerged as the undisputed leader of the group. Throughout 1955 and 1956, they trained in secrecy, gathering weapons and recruits. In December 1956, Fidel and 81 others boarded a small, overcrowded yacht called the Granma and set sail for Cuba. The journey was delayed and chaotic. When they finally landed, Batista's forces were waiting. Most of the rebels were killed or captured within days. Once again, Fidel survived. With a handful of fighters, including Che Guevara and his brother Raul, he escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. There, against all odds, they began a guerrilla war. Life in the mountains was brutal. Food was scarce. Weapons were limited. Batista's army was far larger and better equipped. But Fidel understood something his enemies did not. Batista had lost the support of the people. The rebels gained local backing by treating peasants with respect, paying for supplies, and punishing abusive soldiers. Fidel proved himself as a disciplined commander and a skilled propagandist. He gave interviews to foreign journalists, presenting the rebels as freedom fighters rather than bandits. His message spread beyond the mountains. As Batista's regime grew weaker and more isolated, Fidel's movement gained strength. By late 1958, Batista's army was collapsing. Desertions increased. Cities fell one by one. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. Fidel Castro was on his way to Havana. When Fidel Castro entered Havana in January 1959, he was welcomed as a national hero. After years of dictatorship under Fulgencio Batista, many Cubans saw him as a symbol of hope and renewal. He wore his olive green fatigues, spoke plainly, and promised justice rather than revenge. At first, Fidel insisted he was not seeking power for himself. He claimed the revolution belonged to the people. Within months, it became clear that Cuba was entering a profound transformation. The new government moved quickly to dismantle Batista's political and military structures. Former officials, soldiers, and police officers associated with torture and repression were put on trial. Some were executed after public proceedings. Supporters saw this as justice long delayed. Critics saw it as the beginning of rule by fear. Fidel did not initially take the title of president. Instead, he positioned himself as the moral authority behind the government, appointing others to formal roles while he dominated public life through speeches and mass rallies. His presence was constant. He spoke for hours, sometimes daily, explaining policies, defending decisions, and shaping how the revolution was understood. One of the first major changes was land reform. Large estates were broken up and redistributed to peasants or taken over by the state. Foreign-owned businesses, especially those controlled by American corporations, were nationalized. For many poor Cubans, these measures felt like long overdue corrections. For the United States, they were an unacceptable threat to economic interests. Relations between Havana and Washington deteriorated rapidly. The United States imposed economic sanctions and cut diplomatic ties. Fidel responded by drawing closer to the Soviet Union. By 1960, Cuba was receiving Soviet oil, weapons, and financial support. In return, Fidel aligned the island firmly within the socialist camp. In April 1961, the tension exploded. A force of Cuban exiles, trained and backed by the United States, landed at the Bay of Pigs in an attempt to overthrow Fidel's government. The invasion failed within 3 days. Fidel personally took command of the defense. The victory became a defining moment. It confirmed his belief that compromise with the United States was impossible. Shortly after, Fidel publicly declared Cuba a socialist state. Political parties outside the revolutionary movement were dissolved. Independent newspapers disappeared. Opposition voices were silenced, imprisoned, or driven into exile. Fidel argued that unity was essential to defend the revolution. Critics argued that freedom was being sacrificed in the name of survival. The world's attention returned to Cuba in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union secretly placed nuclear missiles on the island. When the United States discovered them, the world stood at the edge of nuclear war. For 13 days, global tension reached a level unseen before or since. Fidel urged the Soviets to stand firm, even suggesting that Cuba should be prepared to face destruction rather than surrender. In the end, Moscow negotiated directly with Washington. The missiles were withdrawn in exchange for U.S. concessions. Fidel was not included in the final agreement. He felt betrayed, but Cuba's strategic importance had been permanently secured. Inside Cuba, the revolution continued to reshape daily life. Education became free and universal. A massive literacy campaign reduced illiteracy dramatically within a single year. Healthcare was expanded, with doctors sent to rural areas that had never seen medical services before. These achievements became central to Fidel's international image. At the same time, the state tightened its grip on society. The committees for the defense of the revolution were created in every neighborhood. They monitored political loyalty and reported suspicious behavior. Travel was restricted. Religious institutions were sidelined. Many artists and intellectuals were pressured to conform or remain silent. Fidel ruled through personal authority rather than formal institutions. He involved himself in nearly every major decision, from agricultural planning to foreign policy. His speeches could last 5 or 6 hours, blending history, ideology, humor, and warning. Supporters saw these speeches as lessons. Critics saw them as instruments of control. In foreign affairs, Fidel Castro sought to export revolution. He believed Cuba had a duty to support liberation movements across the developing world. Cuban advisors and fighters were sent to Africa and Latin America. In Angola, Cuban troops played a decisive role in a civil war. Medical brigades followed, earning Cuba diplomatic influence far beyond its size. Che Guevara's execution in Bolivia in 1967 was a heavy blow. Che had been the revolution's romantic symbol, while Fidel was its strategist. His death marked the end of one phase of revolutionary ambition, but Fidel remained committed to Cuba's global mission. Economically, Cuba struggled. Central planning led to inefficiency. The ambitious 10-million-ton sugar harvest of 1970 failed, despite massive mobilization. Fidel publicly accepted responsibility for the failure, a rare admission. The economy became increasingly dependent on Soviet subsidies. By the mid-1970s, Cuba had stabilized politically but remained tightly controlled. A new constitution in 1976 formalized Fidel's leadership as both head of state and government. The revolution had become the system. Dissent had little space to exist. Fidel Castro had evolved from a guerrilla leader into a ruler whose power was absolute. To his supporters, he was a defender of sovereignty and social justice. To his opponents, he was an authoritarian figure who tolerated no challenge. As the Cold War deepened, Fidel stood firmly in the socialist camp. Cuba was no longer just an island nation. It was a symbol, a warning, and an inspiration, depending on who was watching. The revolution had survived its most dangerous years. The next challenge would be survival without illusion. By the early 1980s, Fidel Castro had been in power for more than 2 decades. The revolutionary excitement of the early years had faded, replaced by routine, discipline, and quiet fatigue. Cuba was stable in political terms, but the stability came at a cost. The state controlled nearly every aspect of life. Loyalty was expected, dissent was punished, and leaving the country had become a dangerous act. In 1980, the pressure erupted publicly during the Mariel boat lift. After Fidel announced that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so, More than 125,000 people fled to the United States over a few months. The exodus included workers, families, and professionals, but also prisoners and psychiatric patients released by the state. For Fidel, the event was both a release valve and a humiliation. It revealed the depth of frustration inside the country and damaged the image of unanimous revolutionary support. During the rest of the decade, Cuba remained afloat largely because of the Soviet Union. Subsidized oil, guaranteed sugar prices, and trade agreements kept the economy functioning. In return, Fidel remained one of Moscow's most loyal allies. He defended Soviet actions abroad and hosted a visible socialist presence in the Western Hemisphere. Yet even with Soviet support, inefficiency was everywhere. Agriculture lagged. Housing shortages worsened. Black markets quietly flourished. Fidel responded with more discipline and more control. Campaigns against corruption were launched. Officials were publicly shamed or imprisoned. Fidel positioned himself as the incorruptible guardian of revolutionary morality, even as the system itself struggled to function. Everything changed in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Almost overnight, Cuba lost its main economic lifeline. Imports collapsed. Fuel disappeared. Factories shut down. Food became scarce. Public transport nearly stopped. This period became known as the special period in time of peace, a phrase that masked the reality of near economic collapse. Cubans survived through improvisation. Bicycles replaced buses. Power cuts became routine. People lost weight. Malnutrition spread quietly. Many believed the government would fall. It did not. Fidel refused to abandon socialism, but he adjusted just enough to survive. Limited private enterprise was allowed. Farmers' markets reopened. The use of U.S. dollars was legalized. Tourism was expanded aggressively, creating a dual economy where those with access to foreign currency lived better than those without. Inequality, once officially denied, became visible again. Politically, Fidel made no concessions. Protests were met with arrests. Independent journalists were harassed or imprisoned. Emigration continued, including dramatic raft crossings across the Florida Straits. Fidel framed every crisis as external aggression, blaming the U.S. embargo for internal suffering. Many Cubans accepted this explanation. Others did not. In 1998, Pope John Paul II visited Cuba. It was a rare moment of openness. Religious restrictions eased slightly. Churches reopened their doors. Fidel appeared in public alongside the Pope, signaling flexibility without surrender. In the early 2000s, Cuba found new allies. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, became a crucial partner. In exchange for doctors and medical expertise, Cuba received subsidized oil. The alliance eased pressure and reinforced Fidel's belief that resistance could outlast any enemy. Health, however, was becoming an unavoidable issue. After decades of constant visibility, Fidel began to withdraw. In July 2006, he underwent emergency surgery for intestinal bleeding. For the first time, he temporarily handed power to his brother, Fidel Castro. Many assumed it was a short absence. It was not. In 2008, Fidel formally resigned as president. Fidel took over officially, introducing cautious economic reforms and a more pragmatic style. Fidel remained alive, influential, and symbolically powerful, but no longer in command. He wrote newspaper columns, met visiting leaders privately, and appeared occasionally in carefully staged photographs. The man who once spoke for hours now communicated through short written reflections. The image of the tireless revolutionary had faded into that of an aging patriarch, watching history rather than directing it. On November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro died at the age of 90. His death triggered both mourning and celebration. In Havana, crowds gathered to honor him. In Miami, exiles danced in the streets. Few leaders had inspired such opposing emotions. Fidel Castro's legacy remains deeply divided. To supporters, he was the man who gave Cuba dignity, education, and healthcare. He stood up to powerful enemies and refused to bend. To critics, He was an authoritarian ruler who silenced opposition, limited freedom, and forced millions into exile. What is beyond dispute is his endurance. Fidel Castro ruled longer than any other leader in the Western Hemisphere in modern history. He survived assassination attempts, invasions, economic collapse, and global political shifts. He outlasted 10 U.S. presidents and the Cold War itself. Fidel did not simply lead Cuba. He defined it. His beliefs shaped its institutions, its fears, and its pride. Even after his death, Cuba continues to live in his shadow. History will continue to argue over whether he saved his country or imprisoned it. What cannot be argued is that Fidel Castro changed the course of Cuban history forever.